Hello again, Year 12. Carrying on with research methods. I'll keep it fairly brief because I've had to turn the fans off and it's hot, but they're a bit noisy. Yeah, I'm recording this on Thursday afternoon. You've probably had a very busy day in the garden or something like that. Just imagine where we might have been this afternoon. Yeah, doesn't bear thinking about. Anyway, sampling this week. So again, all of this is really important stuff. Terminology that you need to be able to use without hesitation. You need to really understand how these things work. You need to know why you might choose to do them. You need to know the pros and cons of these different approaches. Okay, so again, I'm not putting in lots of different topics. I'd rather do one well. Okay, so sampling is all we're covering this week. So this is what's on the specification. Ultimately, you've got 5 different ways of obtaining the sample for your study. You need to know what those techniques involve, and like I've said, the strengths and limitations. So bias and generalizations, what are the implications if you choose to use these approaches. So just some key terminology before we start on the different sampling methods. The sample, your sample is who is going to take part in your study, so your participants. Okay, so when you've written about 50 participants, that's the sample that was used. Okay, that's probably fair enough. Now, target population, this is the group that the sample is taken from, and in theory, you want your sample to represent the target population so that you can generalize your findings. Okay, there's no point having a small group from the population that don't reflect the population as a whole. Now that's going to be a recurring issue with some of these ones that we're going to come to. But in theory, if you want to generalize what you found in your study to the target population, the group that you're interested in, then you need to know that it represents that population. Okay, so whatever you do, make sure you've got those terms clear in your head. The sample is a group who do the study. That sample is taken from the target population. So the first one, random sampling. Now I have put this in bold underlined. People throw in random sample quite liberally, and it's a very specific thing. So this is the key thing. Every member of the target population has an equal chance of being selected. So sometimes there's a scenario where they stop people on the street and say, oh yeah, it's a random sample because it's just random people. No, it's not. That's something else. So random sample, everybody in the target population has an equal chance of being selected for the study. So you identify your target population. I'll work through an example in a bit. You identify your target population, and then you find a way of giving everybody in that population an equal chance of being selected. Now I've given the image of the National Lottery machine there. I don't know, is it 50 balls in there? I'm not sure. But each one of those has an equal chance. So imagine there was 50 people in your population, obviously a very small population, but go with it. If there's 50 people in your target population, and you want a sample of 6, then in this scenario, every one of those balls has an equal chance of being selected. Everybody in the target population has an equal chance of being selected. It is a random sample. Okay, that's what we're getting at here. Okay, so this can be, if you ever asked how would you go about doing a random sample, it can be names out of a hat. Particularly, you get quite a lot of school-based ones where you're not actually dealing with huge numbers of people. So say we were doing something in the class and I was going to do a random sample, I'd probably just put your names in a hat and mix them around and pick one out. So you can do that, or you could use some computer software. You could allocate a number to each person and then use a random number generator to select them that way. Select the first one and then again for the second one and so on. But the bit that's in bold, underlined, get that in your head. Random sample, every member of the target population has an equal chance of being selected. If you can't see that, chances are you're not looking at a random sample. So we're going to talk about bias through a lot of these. And with a random sample, in theory, that takes away researcher bias. There'll be other approaches that we'll look at where the researcher potentially could influence who takes part in the study. But a random sample, it can be anybody. So I've put the example here of feedback on the A-level psychology course. Now, using some of the methods we'll come to, like volunteer samples. Oh, who's going to volunteer to come along at lunchtime to give me some feedback on the psychology course? Oh, yeah, me. Well, I don't know, potentially you might have somebody like that. That's going to be quite biased, where actually to get real feedback on the A-level psychology course without any influence from me, without me ending up with the students that I think will say nice things, a random sample would do that. Okay, so if I want a random sample of 5 out of the 40 odd students that we've got, then that could be any 5, and I haven't got any say over that whatsoever. There's no I know it's not an experiment, but there's no researcher bias coming in there. Okay, so that's the good thing with this. It should remove experimental bias. A practical thing though, always bear in mind practical things in research methods. It is time consuming compared to some of the other ones we'll be looking at. And you can always, once we've covered all of these, you can always play them off against each other. It reads really well in answers when somebody shows that they really get it. Okay, so while this might be the ideal in reducing bias, it still takes a lot more time to do this. And ultimately, the people selected still have to want to do it. So, yes, you can have your random sample, but then from that, you might end up with the people from the random sample that said, oh, yeah, I'll do that. And then we're back to the psychology situation, because I could have my random sample of students, but then some of them could say stuff that I'm not doing that in my lunch hour. And then I still end up with the people that are going to give a more favourable response. Now, it's unlikely if you've got a decent sized sample, but if it's a smaller sample, then you could still end up with a slightly biased sample there. Okay, or even by chance, if it's a small sample, they might all share traits. By chance, I could select the 4 or 5 most keen and eager psychology students just by chance if it's a small sample. Bigger sample, the less of an issue that's likely to be. Systematic sampling. But sociologists, I think some of these crop up in sociology as well. This is where you have a predetermined system for selecting your participants. So say you get all the Year 12 psychology students in alphabetical order and say, yeah, we're going to use every 5th one. 5th, 10th, 15th, 20th, and so on. That's systematic sampling. Okay, there's not too much more to say about it. Of course, I will be recommending you read in greater depth after this. Again, should be free from researcher bias because I can't fix that. Okay, it's predetermined which numbers are going to be selected. But again, there's always that risk if it's not a big enough sample that they still could share certain traits, could be slightly biased. And again, I haven't put it on here, but do bear in mind, even this isn't as straightforward as some of the alternatives. So if you're ever sitting there thinking, oh, crikey, I can't remember a strength or a limitation of this, play them off against each other. Okay? So that's systematic. There's not too much more to say about that, but certainly not random. I hope you see the difference between random and systematic. Now, this one causes headaches. How shall I go about this? Right, stratified sample. Any target population is going to have subgroups within it. Now, what those subgroups are depends. It could be male, female, age groups, ethnic groups. We talk about religious groups in RE. Now, if you want a sample, if you do stratified sampling, those groups will be represented in your sample to the same proportion. Okay, so if we go back to GCSE religious studies for a while, religious belief in the UK, and you've got about 60% Christian, 25% no religion, maybe 5% Muslim, and so on. If we want a stratified sample, those percentages will be the same in my sample. So whatever sample size I do, I will need 60% of them to be Christian, okay, 5% to be Muslim. So I really don't think it's that hard an idea, but I think some of the terminology puts people off. Just bear in mind, if you're doing a pie chart, the pie charts would look the same. So I've got a target population of 100 here, and then a sample of 10. You would have the same proportions represented within that. Okay, so 50 out of 100 are the yellow group. So 50% are the yellow group. Then in my sample of 10, 50% would need to be the yellow group, meaning that 5 participants would be the yellow group. Okay. It's not as hard as students make it. If you don't get it, then again, read about it a bit more. I'll give you some pointers later on. But that's stratified sampling. The other thing is not to get mixed up between systematic and stratified. So, pros and cons. Again, shouldn't be room for researcher bias, because once you've decided on these groups, then you would randomly select the participants from those groups to take part. Okay, so that should get rid of researcher bias. And the key thing with this, it really should represent the target population. If you've got the right quota for each different subgroup, then you really should be able to generalize it to the whole population. But again, this is very difficult, time consuming. First of all, you've got to work out the different groups, you've got to identify the groups, then you've got to identify the proportion of those groups, and then you've got to go about getting your random sample from it. So this is a lot of hard work compared to some of the other ones coming up. Okay, so there's potentially a trade-off that you'll see here between the reduction in bias, but with that reduction in bias comes an increase in hassle, for want of a better word, time, money, and all of that to get the sample in place. There's a bit of a trade-off there, which is why we do see some of the ones more often, such as opportunity sampling. Now this is the passers-by on the high street one. That's not random, it's opportunities. It's who's there and willing to take part at the time. The number of times at university we'd finish a lecture and they'd say, oh, before you go, we've got a student here who'd really like you all to complete their questionnaire. There you go, job done. So straight away you might have 100, you might have your example 100 people completing a questionnaire. That student has got his or her data set in 5 or 10 minutes. Okay, so very convenient. Whoever is available and willing to take part at that time. So this is that trade-off. So yes, it is a lot more straightforward, quicker, easy. That person's got their sample just like that, saving a lot of time and money, which you do have to bear in mind with research. We've got to be realistic and practical with all of this. But as I said, there is a trade-off, and the trade-off is the issue of bias. If you've got a snapshot of, well, they would have had a snapshot of psychology students, there might be something fundamentally different about psychology students to other students. Now, if you want to generalize this, it's unlikely they were investigating the views of psychology students on something. They probably want to generalize it to students full stop. That's quite a problem. If I've got a sort of study area there, if I go into a sixth form study room on a very hot Thursday lunchtime, and I just use whoever's in there to give feedback on course, again, there might be a certain type of person that is working in a boiling hot room when they could be enjoying a I don't know what those called, those icy coffee things, if it's open. Anyway, they'll be doing something else, put it that way, probably out and about. So that's the downside of this, the trade-off between convenience and the risk of bias. The greater the risk of bias, the less chances of you being able to really generalise your findings, which of course is what we're after. And this one should be obvious, volunteer sampling. This is where participants select themselves by responding to an advert. So I'm going back to university examples. Yes, sometimes they sort of pounced at the end of lectures, but also all the walls were covered with A4 paper saying, come along to this room at this time to take part in my study on something, you will be given a Mars bar or a pound or something pretty feeble, but times are hard when you're a student, so you go along. This could be in a newspaper, online, probably even more so now, but one way or another, the people are choosing, putting themselves forward to take part. So these should be obvious. It will say something like posters or advert in a newspaper. It will be that blatant. That's a volunteer sample. Yeah, still quicker and easier than some of those earlier methods that we looked at. You put the effort out there and you won't see who turns up. That's certainly a lot easier than stratified or random and things like that. But here's a key one, good term for you to use, volunteer bias. It could be that a certain type of person responds to requests to participate in research. Most people probably can't be bothered. So what is it about that person? So what we tend to say is there might be a higher level of motivation in people who volunteer to take part in studies. They might be more inquisitive than other people. They could have various character traits that would therefore mean you've got a sample of people who don't actually represent the general views. Another example I use, let's get the views of the local area on environmental concerns in this region. Please come along to the town hall at 8 AM on Saturday morning to take part in our research, and you draw the conclusion, oh wow, the people of this area are really fussed about environmental issues. No, they're not. Most of them couldn't give a stuff. Most of them are still in bed and really not that bothered. So you've ended up with a sample of people who are more motivated than the rest to take part in your research. So volunteer bias, that higher level of motivation, is an issue. That's where the Hermione, oh, pick me, that kind of person could be wanting to take part. That's it. Okay, so again, not loads of things. I need you to know this well. So obviously I've got no way of knowing if you're doing this. The questions that are coming your way aren't too hard with all of the prompts you've got. So I'm trusting that you are doing the additional reading as well. So the topic companion section, 28 to 32. Don't forget the new digital version of the textbook. Make sure you're following the link. It's on the information sheet that I give to you. 176, 177. You need your definitions without any hesitation. You need at least one strength and one limitation. Complete the questions on the answer sheet using the topic companion. But do watch out. I have changed them slightly. There's one or two questions that aren't the same as what's in the book. Okay, that's not a mistake. I want you to go with what I've chosen. I felt there was a missed opportunity for some application. So if it says something like with reference to this study, I really want to see you engaging with that study and thinking, oh, okay, then what precisely with this study could affect this? Okay, but ultimately that's it, and that is due Friday the 3rd of July. Right, I'm off to put the fans on and have an ice cream. Have a great weekend.